that we are as people, fully why it is that we are how we are as people. And that's true on so many different levels, but let me give you one example. It seems as though there is something innate within us that finds pleasure in hearing or at least knowing some dirt about somebody. Isn't it? I mean, there's something negative, there's something adverse that's going on in somebody's life, and there's some joy in us knowing that, and sometimes then being able to share that with somebody else. You say, well, oh, Michael, no, that's not me. I don't rejoice and I don't find any pleasure in knowing anything negative or adverse about anybody. Well, odds are that's not true because you probably watch or listen to the news, right? And what does the news tell us? It tells us all the stuff that's wrong. I mean, all the ways in which individuals or groups of people or nations or leaders or whatever have colored outside the lines. And so we tune in, we listen, we read, because there is this desire within us somehow to know the dirt on somebody else. Now that extends only, though, to people outside the faith. Christians aren't that way. Christians absolutely don't find any pleasure in knowing anything ill or out of bounds about somebody else. And we wouldn't dare, as Christians at all, never in a million years would we dare share something negative about somebody else. Christians would not do that. We share prayer requests. And when I say that, if you have been around church, whether it's this one or it's, whatever, growing up, if you have been in a small group at some point in time, you know exactly what it is that I'm talking about. That there have been instances where maybe before a Bible study was to begin where there was an opportunity to share prayer concerns. And don't misunderstand me at all. I'm not suggesting that we ought not be praying and helping bear each other's burdens. I think there's a biblical mandate for that we ought to be praying for the concerns that are on our hearts. But and there have been instances where I have observed this repeatedly over the years, where somebody is telling a story during that prayer request time, and the only reason they're sharing it is because sharing some dirt on somebody. But you can kind of do it legally during that time because it's under the pretense of a prayer request, because really there can't be any reason that those details would be shared unless it's just kind of fun to spill the beans on somebody. Now, we kind of recoil against that when we recognize it for what it is, when someone is just sharing dirt for the sake of sharing dirt. We're going to look at a passage this morning that may lead you in part to ask a question based on that same thought. Let me give it to you in a nutshell. We've been looking at Noah. We're winding down today this series on the life of Noah that I've been calling Solitaire, Standing Firm While Standing Alone. And it's based on where in verse 1 of chapter 7 in Genesis, God says that he saw that Noah alone lived righteous before him in his generation. And of course, because of that, God spared Noah and his family and the animals that were led on the ark, while the rest of the earth got a reformat, wiped the hard drive. So we're looking today as we wind down Noah, and this is what we're told in a nutshell. Noah gets drunk, exposes himself. One of his sons kind of mocks him. He experiences then a generational curse because of that, and then Noah dies. You say, well, what in the world do you do with that? Noah did what? Wait a minute, I thought this was the guy who lived righteous alone before the Lord in his generation. What's he doing like this? In fact, why is God telling us this? Is it just to spray him up and to take him down a notch or two? Because, candidly, oftentimes we wind up sharing dirt about or hearing dirt or finding pleasure in the dirt on others because that makes us feel a little more happy with what we see when we look in the mirror. Is that what's going on here, or is it possible that there's something instructive in this? Well, obviously, I believe that it made its way into the pages of Scripture, not because God and not because Moses wanted to spray Noah up, but because there's something for us, even today as followers of Christ, to learn in this. But what in the world could it be? Look with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. And we are going to start reading with verse 18. Genesis 9, verse 18. All right, so Noah's sons who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. He's going to play prominent in what's getting ready to occur. These three were Noah's sons, and from them the whole earth was populated. Noah, as a man of the soil, began planting a vineyard. He drank some of the wine, became drunk, and uncovered himself in his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a cloak and placed it over both their shoulders, and walking backward, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father naked. Now, when Noah awoke from his drinking and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Canaan is cursed. He will be the lowest of slaves to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be Shem's slave. Let God extend Japheth. Let Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem. Let Canaan be Shem's slave." Noah lived 350 years after the flood, so Noah's life lasted 950 years, then he died. Wouldn't it be a lot nicer if, as you're reading through Genesis, Noah steps off the ark, and we're told he lived 350 years after the flood, and then he died? Can we not agree that would be a better ending? But that's not the ending we get. We get what we just read beforehand. But before we consider that, let's get the context back in our mind. When last we left Noah, he had just disembarked the ark. I guess that's where disembark came from. So he's just gotten off the ark. There's no welcoming committee. There's no people out there to say, "We're so glad that you're back home, so glad to see you," because there is no one and nothing living on the earth. That which is living now was on the ark and is coming off with Noah. And that, and perhaps more than anything else, underscores the significance of what God has done for Noah and for his family, how they have been spared when so many others simply were not. And last week we looked at what he does immediately then is to offer a sacrifice to the Lord, because Noah clearly understands God has done something for me, and what he's done for me warrants a response back in his direction. I want to do something for him to show what you did means something to me. I want to express my gratitude to who you are and for what you've done for me. But at that point, it's time now to just start living outside the ark. And whatever environment it is that Noah is observing is different than anything beforehand. Stuff looks different. So much is gone. There's not other people. It seems clearly based on this passage that they were able to, perhaps almost certainly with some supplies that were taken onto the ark, they were able to construct some tents. But maybe the tents, and because tent just means temporary dwelling, maybe it was with some wood and debris and some stuff that they found to build some temporary dwellings. But they've got to have shelter, and the other thing they've got to have is food. And so we're told in this passage that Noah was a man of the soil. He's a farmer. This is familiar territory for him, and so Noah, almost certainly then with his sons, begins this whole process of farming. And Noah, one of the things that he constructs out in the fields is a vineyard. Vineyards produce grapes, grapes produce wine, and so Noah experiences part of his harvest. And so Noah starts drinking, and Noah gets drunk. But it's clear that Noah isn't just kind of a little happy. He's not just a little buzzed. Noah is sloshed. Noah is hammered. In fact, not only what he does confirms that, but the fact that after this whole escapade, his other sons have to tell him what occurred. He has no recollection of what it is that he's done. He's been drinking to the point he has lost all control. He has no recollection. He has no memories whatsoever of what has occurred. Noah is absolutely hammered. And so he is in his tent, and in this drunken stupor, apparently strips off all of his clothes. And then we're told in this passage that Ham observes this. Maybe it is that he is sharing a tent with us. We don't know exactly the circumstances. We're not told anything certain other than what we have just read. And so he sees this, observes this, and he tells his two brothers, Shem and Japheth, outside. The sense is, based on context, that he's like, come look at Daddy. That's kind of the sense that you get. But instead of them coming in and giggling, we're told that Shem and Japheth take a cloak, and they get a blanket or something, and they kind of put it on their shoulders, stretched in between them, and they're backing up towards Daddy, saying, hey, just please, Daddy, cover yourself up. And so they don't even look in his direction, much less giggle, mock, and jeer. All right, so verse 24, it says, when Noah awoke from his drinking, so this is probably the next day, he's sobered up enough to think a coherent thought, probably feels terrible, probably has a splitting headache, and he's probably thinking, well, I wonder what happened, because he doesn't know what has happened. And so he doesn't know about any of this episode with Ham until Shem and Japheth tell him about it. And then he pronounces a curse. We'll talk more about in just a little bit. But again, we're left with this question: why in the world why did this make it? I mean, is this just God trying to say, well, unless you think Noah was all too high and mighty, lest you think Noah was so great, let's take him down a notch or two and say, hey, look at what he did. Is this God? Is this Moses later in recounting these stories just trying to spray Noah up? Or is this an instructive opportunity? Well, obviously, I'm sharing this this morning because I believe it to be an instructive opportunity. And as we wind down looking at Noah's life, it is good to learn from the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we get some of the latter here in this passage. So what in the world is it that this can teach us? I think the first thing is this: small sins can have and involve big costs. Small sins can still involve big costs. This particular passage has been troubling for a lot of Old Testament commentators because of some of the language that is used and the ability, in particular with Hebrew, where one word can have a more broad range of definitions than, for example, more precise words in the Greek New Testament. And so there is this thought, and some have argued that what we're told here is kind of euphemistically speaking. And it wasn't simply that Noah exposed himself to Ham and that Ham saw, and the context seems to suggest that he kind of laughed about all that he saw. But there is something more sexually out of bounds that's occurring, and the text is trying to share it in a more mannerly way. That what actually occurred is more out of bounds than just indecent exposure and mockery. Is that possible? I won't bore you with the details of their argument, but I'm willing to say it's possible. Do I think that that's the case? I don't know. I don't know. And some of these commentators have made very, very well thought out, reasoned, studied arguments. I am willing to say this: it's not necessary that it be more than that. It's not necessary for it to be any more than what we have just read. The thought, though, is we would probably appreciate if this is just speaking euphemistically. We would candidly appreciate if there was more to the story than what we are told. On what basis would I say that? Because I think there is this sense as we read this, boy, that sure seems like an overreaction. Yes, Ham colored out of the lines, but my goodness, a generational curse? That seems like, I mean, he does this, but the reaction is 10 times greater. That doesn't make sense. We don't like that thought, because in life, so many times we operate as our criminal code does. For example, if you are speeding out on Hilltop Road, you get a ticket. you don't go to the death chamber, right? If you rob a bank, minimum sentence is 7 years. You may get 7 to 20 for bank robbery. But if you kill somebody, you may get life imprisonment. You may even get the death penalty. And so we operate with this mindset that the consequences of what you do track proportionally with the nature of what you have done. So if there is an infraction, that there is a consequence proportionately in keeping with the infraction. And so when we come to biblical passages like that, we're like, wait a minute, time out. Noah gets drunk, exposes himself. Ham sees this, laughs, giggles, goes, tells his brothers about it, and then gets a generational curse. Wait, that just doesn't seem right. That does not seem fair. I mean, at the end of the day, in terms of what it is that Ham is doing, he is dishonoring his father. Yeah, that can go into the sin category, but my goodness, it certainly seems like a gross overreaction. It should not be that way. What you and I have freedom to weigh in on is this: whether it is or not that we sin. That's it. What we don't get to weigh in on, and what we don't get to determine, and what we really have no ability to affect or influence at all, is the nature of or the scope of the consequences of that. You get to decide whether you sin. You don't get to decide what the consequences are. And sometimes, even for the things that you perceive to be minor infractions, they may have grossly larger consequences. You say, well, I don't know about that, Michael. Maybe this is just kind of an exemption. Maybe this is kind of a one and done type thing. Are there other biblical examples about this? Yes. Go a little bit later in the Old Testament, go over to Chronicles, and you can read the story of David doing something. And interestingly, it wasn't adultery. It wasn't the murder of his girlfriend's husband. Do you remember David did something that had more rippling consequences on more people and more families than either of those two things? And you remember what it was? He conducted a census. He counted the people. Now, the context seems to suggest that the ordering of this census of the nation of Israel was rooted with pride in his heart. Does God view pride as sin? Sure he does. God recoils at. God finds loathsome pride. But this pride motivated the ordering of the census, and what happened? People died. Do you remember how many? 70,000. Because David ordered a census. Like, wait a minute. It wasn't for the adultery? It wasn't for the murder? No, for conducting a census. You say, oh, okay, well, I'll grant you that example. But still, that's kind of Old Testament anyway. And Old Testament stuff, there's weird stuff going on anyway, because Noah's getting ready to live over 950 years at this point. So, my goodness, there's a lot of bizarre things that are going on in the Old Testament. So, we don't see that type of thing in the New Testament. What you see is sin and proportionate consequence in the New Testament. What about this example? Not only is this example in the New Testament, this is after the birth of the church, after the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. There was a couple that sold some land. You remember them? Their names were Ananias and Sapphira. And they sold some land, and they wanted to give proceeds to the church from the sale of this land. The problem is not that they didn't give it all. The problem it was that they presented themselves as having given it all. So it's as if they said, hey, we sold this plot of land, we made $50,000 off of it, and so here's a check for $50,000. When in truth, they sold it for $100 and are giving $50. So at the end of the day, what have they done? They've lied. They've lied. You ever done that? Some of you are telling one right now. Yes, you have done that. Ananias and Sapphira lost their lives that day. Peter didn't kill them. The leaders of the early church did kill them. God struck them that day. They dropped dead as a doornail. You say, Michael, I don't get that. You know what I say? I don't either. I don't either. Oftentimes when we are making choices about what it is that we do, we're gambling, playing some risk assessment. If I do this range of things can happen. What I'm telling you is this: you have no idea what can fall into that range. And if you are thinking, well, this little thing won't cost me. I will do this because nobody else will know. This won't affect anybody else. This little small thing, I'm telling you this. This passage, if nothing else, it communicates that even small sins can cost in big, big ways. God's not trying to spray Noah up. Moses isn't trying to spray Noah up. This is a teachable moment, and I think it communicates to us that small sins can have big costs, but the other thought, or second thought, is this: others may face consequences that you don't. Others may face consequences that you don't. I don't have time to flesh this out with any great detail. Who sees his father's nakedness? Ham does. Who goes and tells the brothers about it? Ham does. Look at verse 24. Noah awoke from his drinking, learned what his youngest son had done, and what does he say? Canaan is cursed. Who's Canaan? It's Ham's son. Wait a minute. Shouldn't that say Ham is cursed? He will be the lowest of slaves to his brothers. Not only do we consistently operate with the mindset that small sins generate small consequences, we generate or operate with the notion that my actions and my behaviors, my choices, affect what I determine that it affects. Oftentimes, just me. So many times, and I talked about this with my class on Wednesday morning, and you've heard people say this, you might have even said this before. Well, this only affects me. And in reality, there is absolutely nothing that you do that occurs in a vacuum. Everything that you do has some effect, small or great, on at least someone else. The example I gave on Wednesday morning was this. I'll just be honest. I don't make the healthiest eating choices. I know you're shocked. Pick your jaw up. I don't make the healthiest eating choices. And it would be easy for me to say, well, that just affects me. I mean, I'm the one that may look like a busted bale of cotton trying to fit into some of the clothes. I'm the one that would get out of breath walking up a flight of stairs. It's easy for me to say that something as simple as what it is that I eat, that only affects me. But it doesn't affect only me, does it? Because what it is that I do affects my overall health. And my overall health doesn't just affect me, it affects my family, doesn't it? I've got a wife and 5 children that have a vested interest in me. They have a vested stake in my well-being. And if I'm in bad shape, that adversely affects them, even though they had nothing to do specifically with what it is that I would eat. You say, well, I can see that. That affects your family. But you know what? It even affects you. Just the other morning I said this. I had a spinal fusion done in December, and because of that, I was out for 3 Sundays. For 3 long Sundays, you were stuck with Shep. You had nothing to do with what was going on in my spine. But what was going on, it affects my family, but it even affects you. And I say that just to underscore this point. You have no idea fully the scope and the scale and the rippling effects of the choices that you make. And if you're operating under this delusional notion, this false notion, well, it's just this little thing. Yeah, I know that's out of bounds. I know that's coloring outside the lines. I know that, but it's just this little thing. It won't bring big consequences. It could be wrong. It'll only affect me. No, it won't. Something as simple as what we read here results in a generational curse because of Ham and what he did. But there's one final lesson I think we can learn from it, and it's this. People on the right road can still make wrong turns. Even people on the right road can make wrong turns. I wanted to finish with this thought because this specifically deals with Noah. And in a series where we have been dealing with Noah, I think this point is well served. Did Ham do something that he shouldn't? Yes. Did he act in dishonoring ways? Yes. Did he act in ways that brought reproach upon himself, and not only on himself, but upon those who would follow him? Yes. Should we defend what Ham did? No. Can we not also agree on this? He didn't start it. At the end of the day, this was Noah's fault. They get off the boat, and who are we told that planted the vineyard? Noah did. Who drank the wine? Noah did. I mean, is there any sense in which the context bears out that Noah is coerced? No, it seems that Noah, he just starts drinking and doesn't exercise any discipline, and he gets drunker and drunker and drunker and drunker until the point he is in an absolute stupor. He is so foggy-headed, he has no idea what it is that he's doing, and the very next day he has absolutely no recollection about what he has done, even going so far as to expose himself to his own sons. Keep in mind this. Noah is over 600 years old. I said this, I think, last week. You know, the only thing worse than a fool is an old one. Why? Because you ought to know better. Noah is over 600 years old, and he is so drunk that he's doing this. You say, well, wait a minute. Well, what's the big deal with that? Well, I think in part this is the big deal. Back in chapter 7, verse 1, we're told that God saw that Noah alone was righteous before him in his generation. I mean, everybody else was essentially living with their fists waved at heaven. Everybody else was doing whatever in the world they wanted to. Everybody else was acting as though there was no God. Everybody else was acting as though there were no standards. But Noah, though not perfect, was trying to operate in bounds. Noah was trying his best, it seems, to keep it between the ditches. Noah, for the better part of 100 years, does exactly what God says, and he constructs this massive ark, even though people had to be saying, Noah, what's the matter with you? Why are you doing this? Are you crazy? Have you lost your mind? In spite of all of that, he is proclaiming what God has said. He is, as Peter describes, a preacher of righteousness in his day. There's so much that Noah is doing right. In fact, so much that he's doing right that God rewards him with life when millions of others lose it. I mean, in so many ways, this is a guy that you can say, man, this is an example about what it looks like to take seriously following God. This is what it looks like to take seriously the whole idea of living God's ways. This is a guy that's on the right road. But this guy who was on the right road, he made a wrong turn in the tent, didn't he? He made a wrong turn just past the vineyard. There's some caution for us in that. Some of you have known and walked with the Lord for a long time. You have a reputation that has been earned over time as somebody who takes seriously following God. You are somebody who has deservedly earned a reputation over time, some of you, as somebody that's really in this and takes seriously what it means to follow Jesus. Let me just tell you, a lot can be lost very quickly. Paul said this, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. I got a strange phone call a few weeks ago from somebody that I've known for a long time, somebody that I respect, somebody that I would say yeah, this is somebody that really is serious about this whole Christian thing. And he called me because he's on our mailing list and had gotten, this is not somebody in as a part of Gate City, so scratch that off your mind. But he called me because he'd gotten our newsletter, and in the calendar of events, he did not see a weekly visitation that was listed. And he called me sincerely to chastise me for not seeing that in there. And so when I gave him my response, conversation continued to unfold. He called me drunk. I'm not lying. He called me drunk. And I said, I want you to understand what's going on here. You're calling me drunk to gripe about there not being weekly visitation in the schedule. Do you see something's wrong with this picture? I'm burdened for him, sincerely. But I'll say this, I am so horribly disappointed with him. How I viewed him, how I thought about him was here. But in just one phone call, I'm thinking, what's the matter with you? Even people on the right road can make some wrong turns, and those wrong turns can be costly. Let me share with you, though, some good news. As this passage ends, this is what we're told. Noah lived 350 years after the flood. Noah's life lasted 950 years, then he died. I recognize that this is an argument from silence, but it seems that Noah, he made a wrong turn at the tent, and he got it back in the lane. The learning lesson, the learning opportunity for us is this. Even if you're on the right road, you can make a wrong turn. But the good news is you can get back on the road. I was trying to think about how to tie all of this together, and there were words to a hymn that kept coming to mind that I think best summarizes this. Maybe you're familiar with it. Marvelous grace of our loving Lord, grace that exceeds our sin and our guilt. That's good news. Noah colored outside the lines, but God's grace was even greater. So where does this meet you this morning? Maybe it is, unbeknownst to anybody else in this room, you've been making some choices where you've been banking on, hey, this is not going to cost me very much. And maybe God is trying to say to you, flashing the yellow light, listen, if this doesn't change, it could cost you big. Maybe God has burdened your heart to say, listen, there needs to be a course correction because there are absolutely innocent people in your life that are going to suffer consequences because of your bad choices. Maybe you need to say, God, help me. I haven't done this perfectly, but help me to keep it in bounds. I don't want to get so prideful that I think it can't happen to me, only to watch it happen to me. Or maybe you say, I've already messed up. I've screwed up. I've lost so much. And God's saying to you, marvelous grace of our loving Lord, grace that exceeds even your sin and your guilt. As He has spoken to you this morning, will you respond to the decisions He's guiding you to make? Pray with me. Lord, for giving